In the final blood-soaked years of World War II, as the world crumbled under the weight of tyranny, a small group of men and women stepped into the shadows with one mission: to hunt down Nazis. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were refugees, commandos, and spies, people who had lost everything to the Nazi regime and were willing to risk their lives to strike back. Long before Hollywood gave us the film Inglourious Basterds, these real-life warriors fought a silent, ruthless war of vengeance and justice. Their story is one of courage, tragedy, and moral complexity. A tale hidden behind classified reports and faded photographs, now slowly emerging from the archives of history. It began in 1942, when the Allies were still reeling from Axis dominance across Europe. Hitler's war machine had swallowed Poland, France, and most of Western Europe. Millions were already dead or imprisoned, and the Nazi regime's genocidal campaign was in full motion. In the chaos, a new kind of warfare took root. One fought not on vast battlefields, but in the shadows of forests, mountain passes, and occupied cities. British intelligence, the American OSS, and underground European resistance groups began recruiting special operatives fluent in German, trained in sabotage, and willing to do anything to break Hitler's grip. Among these units, one stood out: the British X Troop. X Troop was officially part of Number 10 Inter-Allied Commando, a secretive unit formed by the British War Office. But what made it different was its composition. Almost every man in X Troop was a Jewish refugee who had escaped Nazi persecution. Many had lost their families in concentration camps. They came from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, carrying with them a deep hatred of the regime that had destroyed their lives. Their new mission was as personal as it was dangerous: to infiltrate enemy lines, capture intelligence, and destroy the enemy from within. Each member of X Troop adopted a fake British identity. They were given new names, new backstories, and forged documents in case of capture. A man named Manfred Gans became Fred Gray. Another, Peter Masters, born Peter Arani, was trained to blend in perfectly with British troops despite his thick accent. Their commanding officer, Major Brian Hilton Jones, drilled them relentlessly in weapons training, amphibious assaults, and intelligence gathering. These men were not just soldiers. They were psychological weapons, fluent in the enemy's language, able to intercept radio chatter, interrogate prisoners, and even pose as German soldiers. Their first major test came during the D-Day landings. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, members of X Troop landed among them, their mission clear: to interrogate captured Germans on the spot, extract vital intelligence, and relay it immediately up the chain of command. It was an incredibly dangerous job. Unarmed except for pistols, they followed combat units directly into the chaos. But the results were astounding. Within hours, X Troop members uncovered critical information about hidden minefields, German reinforcements, and defensive positions that saved countless Allied lives. One soldier, Lieutenant Peter Masters, later described the chaos: bullets flying everywhere, explosions all around us, and there I was, kneeling beside a wounded German soldier, trying to get him to tell me where the machine gun nests were. It was the kind of intelligence gathering that required both nerve and empathy, a strange duality in war. These men were interrogating their own countrymen, people who might have shared their hometowns or schools, yet had chosen a monstrous path. X Troop's contributions extended far beyond D-Day. As the Allies pushed deeper into France and Germany, these men continued to operate on the front lines, often capturing entire units by using fluent German to pose as officers, tricking Nazi soldiers into surrendering. One such operation involved two members infiltrating a German position under the guise of inspecting troops, only to suddenly pull their pistols and capture an entire bunker. It was equal parts bravery and deception, a war of wits fought against one of the most dangerous armies in history. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another group of Nazi hunters was taking shape. In 1942, the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, began recruiting European exiles to train as secret agents. Many of them were Jewish refugees who had fled Germany. Their mission was similar to ex-troops: gather intelligence, sabotage enemy supply lines, and assist local resistance networks. These OSS units would parachute into occupied Europe under cover of night, armed with radios, maps, and cyanide capsules in case of capture. But not all Nazi hunters fought during the war. Some began their pursuit after it ended, when the world began to grasp the full horror of what the Nazis had done. In the aftermath of 1945, as Allied soldiers liberated concentration camps and the Nuremberg trials began, a new kind of vengeance took shape, one driven by grief and justice. This is where the story of the real Inglourious Basterds deepens into something darker and more morally ambiguous. Among the most famous post-war Nazi hunting groups were the Nokmim, or Avengers, a clandestine band of Jewish survivors determined to take justice into their own hands. Led by Abba Kovner, a poet and resistance fighter from Vilnius, the Nokmim sought retribution for the Holocaust in ways that shocked even Allied authorities. Kovner and his followers believed that traditional justice could never balance the scales of genocide. Their plan was nothing short of biblical revenge: to kill 6 million Germans, one for every Jewish life lost. In 1946, members of the group infiltrated German water supply systems with the goal of poisoning them using arsenic compounds smuggled from Palestine. The plot, known as Plan A, was ultimately foiled when British authorities intercepted the poison shipment. But the Nokmim were not finished. They launched Plan B, targeting former SS prisoners held in Allied camps. In one infamous incident at a POW camp near Nuremberg, hundreds of SS guards were poisoned with arsenic-laced bread. Official reports claimed that no one died, but survivors later hinted that the death toll may have been far higher than admitted. For the Nokmim, revenge was not just about punishment, it was about reclaiming humanity. One member later said, "We were dead already. What could they do to us that they hadn't done?" These actions blurred the line between justice and vengeance, a moral debate that still haunts the legacy of post-war Nazi hunters. Other groups took a more systematic approach. The Nazi hunters who emerged in the 1950s and 60s, such as Simon Wiesenthal and the Mossad agents who captured Adolf Eichmann, represented the institutionalization of what began as vengeance. Wiesenthal, himself a survivor of multiple concentration camps, dedicated his life to tracking fugitives of the Third Reich. Working from a small office in Vienna, he compiled lists, shared intelligence with governments, and doggedly followed every rumor. His efforts helped bring over 1,000 Nazi criminals to trial. But long before Wiesenthal became a household name, the seeds of Nazi hunting had been sown by these wartime commandos and refugee soldiers, the real bastards. Their story, overshadowed by official histories, shows how deeply personal the war was for those who fought in the shadows. They weren't motivated by medals or glory. Many never told their families what they'd done. To them, it wasn't heroism. It was survival, justice, and sometimes revenge. The parallels between fact and fiction are fascinating. Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds introduced a stylized, violent revenge fantasy where Jewish American soldiers carved swastikas into Nazis' foreheads and assassinated Hitler in a theater. While that version was pure Hollywood, its inspiration was rooted in the true stories of units like X-Troop and the Nokmim. These real men didn't kill Hitler, but they did something arguably more powerful. They shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. They proved that those who had been hunted could become the hunters. In one remarkable mission, X-Troop members helped liberate concentration camps, translating for Allied forces and identifying SS officers trying to blend in with prisoners. Some even personally interrogated former Gestapo men they had known before the war. Imagine that moment, standing face to face with the monsters of your past, armed not with fear, but with authority. For many, that was the true act of liberation. As the war ended, many ex-troop members were quietly reassigned or discharged. Their true identities remained classified for decades. Some returned to civilian life under their false British names. Others emigrated to America or Israel. It wasn't until the early 2000s that their stories began to emerge publicly, thanks to historians who uncovered wartime records and personal letters. One of those historians, Leah Garrett, spent years tracking down descendants of the commandos, piecing together their remarkable lives. In her interviews, she found that many families had no idea their fathers or grandfathers had been part of such a secret unit. They simply said they served in the war. That silence speaks volumes. These men carried not only memories of what they had done, but the trauma of what they had lost. To fight as a Jewish commando against the Nazis meant living with both triumph and tragedy, the satisfaction of striking back and the grief of knowing it would never undo the past. Their legacy, however, extends far beyond World War II. The tactics pioneered by ex-troop, psychological warfare, rapid interrogation, and deception behind enemy lines would go on to influence modern special forces around the world. Units like the British SAS and the American Green Berets trace part of their lineage to these early unconventional fighters. In that sense, the real Inglourious Basterds helped invent modern special operations. Yet even with their contributions, recognition came late. In 2021, over 75 years after the war, surviving members of ex-troop and their families were finally honored by the British government. Their bravery, long buried by secrecy, was officially acknowledged as a vital part of the Allied victory. When you look closely, the story of these Nazi hunters is not one of revenge alone. It's about identity. These men were exiles, forced to abandon their homes, their families, even their names. But by turning their pain into purpose, they reclaimed power from their oppressors. Their story reminds us that history isn't just written by generals and politicians. It's carried in the memories of those who fought in silence, those who waged wars unseen by the public eye. And then there's the question of morality. History often paints vengeance in shades of darkness. But for the survivors of genocide, the moral lines were never clear. Was it wrong to seek retribution when justice seemed impossible? Could the murderers of millions ever truly be punished in a courtroom? For many of the real Nazi hunters, these questions weren't philosophical. They were personal. Justice was not an abstract ideal. It was something to be reclaimed through action, even if it meant breaking the rules of war. In one haunting interview, a former member of the Nokmim said, "We didn't want to kill Germans. We wanted to make them feel what it was to be powerless." That distinction reveals a deep psychological wound, a desire not just to destroy, but to balance the unbearable scales of suffering. Inglourious Basterds, the film, ended with fiction, a theater burning, a swastika carved into tyranny itself. But the real story ended quietly. The real Nazi hunters faded into history without fanfare. Some lived long lives, others died in anonymity. Yet their legacy survived in the justice they pursued, in the war criminals brought to trial, and in the simple fact that they fought back. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as Hollywood myths, but as human truths. They were men and women forged by loss, united by purpose, and willing to walk through fire to ensure the world would never forget what evil looked like. Today, as we look back through the lens of time, the tale of the real Inglourious Basterds stands as a testament to resilience. It reminds us that in the darkest chapters of history, even those stripped of everything can rise to become instruments of justice. Their war may have ended in 1945, but their impact lives on in every pursuit of accountability, in every act of remembrance, and in every promise that never again will mean something real. The ghosts of ex-troop, the agents of the OSS, the Avengers of the Nokmim, all belong to a secret history beneath the headlines of World War II. They operated without glory, without medals, and without the luxury of forgetting. But in their defiance, they carried the spark of something eternal. The refusal to bow to terror. The belief that one act of courage could stand against the weight of cruelty. That is the true story of the real Inglourious Basterds. Not a story of fantasy, but of fire and endurance. They may not have stormed a cinema to kill Hitler, but in their own quiet way, they rewrote the ending of his empire.